A subscriber sent me a chilling first-hand account of their encounter with something they believe was a real-life Wendigo. So, I had a talented artist, Ad Limbo the Lost, recreate their sighting. Here is that story. Growing up on a small, mostly self-sustained chicken farm, my family had many animals. We would have anywhere from 50 to 200 chickens on the farm, our Alaskan Malamute, a barn cat, and a few other more exotic animals as well. Mostly birds, skunks, or young foxes that I would find in the woods and bring home to nurse back to health. My childhood was full of animals, and considering the chickens would be slaughtered about every 2 or 3 years for meat and sale, I was used to seeing death at a young age. A few times our Malamute got loose, and he would attack many of the chickens. Or that's what we thought. I never actually saw him go at more than one single chicken. The most I saw was the roosters, who we raised for the county fair shows, taunting him, walking into his chained area and pecking him in the face, and running just out of his reach. Honestly, I never blamed the big guy for defending himself when he could. But on 3 occasions, I had come home from school to see my father piling dead chickens on top of one another. Loads of them. And none of them had been attacked in quite the same way that the Malamute did. He would simply snap the neck. But whatever was doing this to the chickens, it left quite the gruesome scene. The animals sometimes tore almost in 2. Not to mention the different breeds were taken care of in different ways. The white-laying hens, who were rather plump and rarely came off their nests, would be missing their heads. The thinner, long-legged Polish, the chickens with the fluffy-looking feathers on their heads, were often nearly completely plucked of their silky plumes. These ones specifically were rarely ever eviscerated, while the rest were. I often helped pick up the dead birds. We slaughtered many for ourselves, and this didn't bother me too much. I never questioned as a young child why our dog would take so many birds like that. As a farm kid, I was told that wolves were bad, and because Malamutes tend to have a large percentage of wolf genetics, it was just his animal DNA kicking in at times. But I didn't believe that, and I could tell that my parents were grasping at straws. It was only in high school, while doing reports for the science teacher, he would have us track various animal sightings throughout the state, and one of them was for deer. I learned a lot of seemingly useless information about deer that month. Their lifespans, mating patterns, size, weight, diet, the whole kebab. But this was when I began to notice that some pieces of the puzzle began to fall together. Almost every time our chickens were unceremoniously slaughtered was just before hunting season. A few weeks afterward, my father would come home boasting that he saw a large deer out in the woods. He boasted that one day he would have that sucker mounted in the house. I knew exactly what deer he was talking about, one that we nicknamed Oscar. When you've been hearing talk of that large deer in the woods for almost 15 years, and you know that white-tailed deer live for about 4.5 years, you begin to get a little skeptical. Anyway, my first encounter with an animal that I actually feared, I was with my childhood best friend. We were about 9 years old, and I wanted to show off the property I'd grown up on. My father had large, deep trails wide enough for his tractor throughout the woods. It was a large, square 30-acre lot. We had a path following the perimeter of the property, and another crisscrossing the square in half from both directions. There were many other trails as well. Those pine woods were alive with life, and I'd often followed game trails, sometimes nearly 50 acres into the neighbor's property. We walked up behind the barn on the north side of the property, following the main trail to the back of what we owned. I'd read a book which was published on the farm about 20 years before my own family moved in. I was telling her about the property and the previous owners. The two of us were nerds, and this kind of information was our bread and butter. Now, usually I cut the walk in half, walking through one of the crisscrossed sections because, frankly, I'm lazy. But I'm also very proud of my home, I had a slew of new information, so we kept walking on this occasion. The sun was getting farther behind us. We had gotten off the school bus about half an hour before, so we were pretty far in. Now, I've encountered this Oscar before, and knowing this, my mother had warned us not to walk too far into the woods. It was rut season, and the bucks may get territorial. Obviously, we didn't listen. Turning with the square-shaped paths, we began to walk south. That's when I spotted one of my favorite game trails. I ushered my friend towards it. I was walking just in front of her then, and she bumped into me. I'd gone quiet for the first time in close to an hour, because I spotted it. A massive deer standing before us. My friend steps out from behind me confused, then gazes past me at the deer as well. We're both awestruck, silent. We're taking in every detail. The deer was on the main trail. The game trail we followed cut off the southeast corner of the property. But this image of the deer that was before us, it wasn't right. Imagine a deer, copy and paste it into a document and scale it up 3 times its original size. The antlers alone could be either side of the trees blocking us from the creature. I remember the dull thud they made when it bumped them against the trees, as if telling us, "You're lucky the trees are in the way." We stood entirely still before we began running, and I'm ashamed to admit that I felt a need to outrun my best friend. Something primal in me, I guess. We made it back, winded, exhausted, and terrified, but also excited to see a deer so big. We told my parents we'd seen Oscar the deer, not once imagining the possible outcome to our fate. Maybe it was our childish minds seeing what looked like a deer, but I was soon beginning to believe that Oscar was something else. About a week after this, my father took me hunting. Up I go into a tree stand, holding onto a thick pine much like the one Oscar had tapped with his horns. This day was cold and foggy. It was a school day, but I was allowed to stay home, and it was also the only year I'd ever go hunting. As I sat in that stand, mostly trying not to fall asleep, I began to turn to look around, eventually scoping out the back side of the tree. Some distance behind me across the path, I saw a large deer. I was excited, ready to tell my father that I spotted something, but I quickly fell quiet. The deer had looked up at me, looked directly at me even from that distance, even with the fog. I felt like I was staring point blank into its face as well. But the typical glossy black eyes of a deer were not the eyes that I met, and I was soon wishing to go back home. I started to complain to my father. I made up every excuse to go home and escape, and finally he relented, on one condition. I was to go walk with him up toward the southeast side to look for deer on foot. The sky seemed to crack apart as we descended the ladder. Rain was falling now through the trees around us, the fog mostly dissipating in the warm shower. I went eastward, while he went south of our position. I ended up nearly at the top of the hill, the one I don't like to go near due to my fear of heights. There was a thicket bush there. It was partly stamped down already, and curious, I poked my head inside and found a young fawn. It was maybe a few days old. I didn't want to disturb it in fear of its mother maybe abandoning it, so I rose up, and as I did, I found myself staring directly at a doe, its mother. She was snorting and stomping in agitation, and instead of charging or trying to push me away, she instead stopped. Her ears went on high alert, then she simply crawled into the thicket, hiding with her fawn. Then I heard the sound of a branch snapping. A branch, not a stick on the ground. It sounded like it had come from somewhere behind me. I walked forward slowly. I could see my father's fluorescent orange cap in the distance. I was stiff as a board when I finally got near him. These woods were beginning to turn sinister. Thankfully, my father was giving up on the day because of the rain and didn't ask me any questions. Apparently, he assumed I was just cold, and that's why I was shaking like a leaf. Later that day, after returning home, my father would come back home after going out again, saying that he saw Oscar walking across the street toward the nearby river. Only at that section it was more like a sandy creek. That was behind our neighbor's house, and oddly enough, to make things worse, the sweet older widow who lived there that I often visited with to birdwatch turned up dead of a heart attack later that same week. Right after her passing, all the sightings of Oscar the deer had died down for nearly 10 more years. Within that time, I began to forget about the weird happenings in the forest and on our property. I had made a friend from across the world who I would video chat with often, and using my phone, I decided one day I'd take a walk with my dog so that I could record the property for her. As I left the house, I went out the back door to show off the large open lawn. I walk across the path, which cuts into the middle of the woods, and I go deeper. As I get near the back end, my dog begins to walk closer to me. I keep going in, despite my dog obviously getting a bit scared, which was completely unlike him. Soon it began to rain, so I decided to turn back toward the house. I didn't want my new phone to get wet. It was my only source of communication with my new foreign friend. I begin to slow down about halfway back, and that's when I begin to hear branches breaking behind me. I turn just so I can show my friend what the sound was. I turn the camera back to the trail, and there's a small oak tree fallen on the path about 50 yards in front of me. A tree that had not been lying there before, nor did I hear it fall and make a sound. Again, all I had heard were branches snapping, so this was quite strange. I look at my dog, who was happily panting now, probably excited to get back home. With that, I decide I'm just being paranoid. I continue to walk back when I suddenly hear a high-pitched, pitiful screech from the direction of our home. If you've ever heard a rabbit scream, it's horrifying. At first, I didn't know what it was, and I began to run towards it. As I get to the house, I find my rabbit dead. He's still warm, though, but there are no footprints in the soft earth, though there should have been. Every part of me was screaming not to stay outside, so I grabbed my perished friend, and I took him inside, only to get him a fleece blanket to wrap him in. I bury him, but I made sure to keep my dog inside while I did. When I was done, I stood up tall. I was on the edge of the woods near the base of our large evergreen pine tree. My eyes were locked on the trees nearby. I then threw the shovel to the ground and shouted at the top of my lungs that this was my home, and whatever was doing this was not welcome. At that point in time, the farm was running low on chickens. All that was really left was a Muscovy duck who was nearly 7 years old. I can say honestly he's still alive somehow. My parents were forced to join the workforce, so it was quieter around here anymore. More sad. I grabbed the shovel and turned. From this view of the farm, the barn is to my right. There is a large red shed in front of me, just off to the right as well. A white shed blocks out most of the view of the red one, and the house is to my left. The road was in my sight, and many trees were sheltered in the large yard toward the west side. Standing in the road, hidden partially by some tree branches, I saw a deer who was the same size and even the same shape as Oscar. It was facing towards me, watching me. I held my ground, still angry at what it did to my rabbit. It must have lost interest, because it looked away from me, and it began to cross the road. But as it did, I finally got a good look at the thing. The creature was massive, but its body was torn, bones showing, and its head was more skull than flesh. I forgot to breathe as I looked at it. When it was gone out of sight, I struggled to breathe again. I went inside, not even feeling safe in my own home. The next day, I would take my dog for a walk, trying to calm down. I was approaching the river that ran parallel to the road, and as I did, the dog began to freak out. I looked up, and down the hill from us, there it stood, knee-deep in the river. I didn't react out of fear. My dog couldn't either. I scooped him up, all 20 pounds of him, and I began to quietly walk back the way we came. By the time I get over a large hill in the road, he calms down, and I'm able to set him down again. I wonder to myself why that thing keeps crossing the road, why it keeps letting itself be seen, but often just barely. I haven't seen it in some time, and I moved out after a while. Maybe it's waiting, maybe it's done with our land, because everything there is dead. I don't know. But that creature made our property a living hell.